Alien combines incredible set design, fantastic performances, beautiful cinematography, a wonderfully restrained soundtrack, and a slow, measured pace to make a film that has aged wonderfully, despite some now obviously outdated special effects. All of the elements it combines, and specifically how they were combined, makes the film what it is, and there were a variety of people that were involved in making Alien. Auteur theory, though not exclusively, would attribute those efforts to a single person, the director. If you're unfamiliar with auteur theory, it's a notion that while many people work on a film or media text, it can be primarily attributed to a single person, most often the director. To make a slightly awkward analogy here, the head builder has the biggest impact on how the house is made, what approach is taken when problems crop up, and acts as the connection between the planning, financial, and on-site work that is involved. Thus, they specifically, made the house. There are a variety of critical responses to auteur theory, but the majority of them fall into one of two camps. The first is that films are a sum of their parts. While some contributors may have greater influence than others, a collaborative project can, and should, only ever be seen as the product of that collaboration, and not a single individual's vision. The head builder might be the most important person during the building of a house, but the bricks were laid and the plans made by other people, without whom the final result might look very different. The other response argues that there is a vision that the whole film can be attributed to, but it's not that of the director. After all, who can make a film without a script? The screenplay offers the blueprints from which the film is made. Here people argue that, sure, the head builder is really important overall, but the house couldn't be made in the first place without the architect and their plans. It doesn't matter that the architect might never set foot on site, their plans are the most important element, and thus the house should be considered theirs. Of the three main positions in this argument, I tend to lean furthest towards the idea that films are collaborative, rather than the result of a singular vision. That said, I don't think any of the three is always right, nor is any of the three always wrong. Most of the time, I think it lands somewhere in the middle. So this is a look at auteur theory through the lens of Ridley Scott's Alien, or Dan O'Bannon's Alien, or H.R. Giger's Alien. I'm opting to use Alien as the entry point to this discussion for a reason. It's a film where, at least in my view, the influence of its multiple creators is keenly felt. Not only does each individual's contributions show up as particularly obvious to me, so does just how much chance and luck is involved in the sorts of large collaborations required to make big budget films. You only need to follow the work of a single person on set to understand what I mean, and just how many people had a hand in making Alien what it was. H.R. Giger's set and creature design, both then and now, look like nothing else, and it lends a particular atmosphere that touches the whole film. Without Giger, Alien would not exist as it does, and I think that's pretty obvious. It also wouldn't exist as it does without Ridley Scott. Indeed, Giger wouldn't have been working on the film if it weren't for Scott insisting on him. Without Dan O'Bannon, who co-wrote the script, Ridley Scott would never have heard about Giger. O'Bannon brought Giger to Scott, but his meeting with Giger was during work for the ultimately doomed Alejandro Jodorowsky adaptation of Dune, where O'Bannon was working on the special effects. Giger himself wasn't known to Jodorowsky, and was originally recommended to Jodorowsky by Salvador Dali, a recommendation without which Alien may never have existed, even though he had nothing to do with the script, production, or team involved with making it. Obviously, to say that Dali had any hand in making Alien is illogical, but his impact on it is noticeable. By tracing the connections and people that brought Giger to Alien, you can start to see one of the biggest shortcomings of the idea of an auteur, where all of the individual efforts, decisions, and coincidences that made the film are reduced down to an overly simple and downright foolish notion that they are all down to the director. To be clear, Dali should not be credited with working on Alien, but O'Bannon, or Giger in my eyes, brought just as much to the film as Scott did. Here I have to mention something important. Proponents of auteur theory don't just call any director an auteur. According to some of the most ardent and pretentious proponents of the auteur, the best cinema is exclusively the work of those special individuals who exert their vision across all or most aspects of the film. And while Ridley Scott has been called an auteur, he likely wouldn't make a list of the most notable auteurs. At least his films exhibit less of a specific vision and style than, for example, a Wes Anderson, Michael Haneke, or Bong Joon-ho film. The notion of the auteur was originally a call for cinema to be taken seriously as art, when it was largely considered shallow entertainment at the time. I don't think any of the people I've mentioned are bad directors by any means, though Scott's recent output has been patchy at best, but the idea only good directors can be auteurs is immediately rife with problems. So Alien is selected deliberately. It hasn't been chosen at random, and it will likely support my position more than another film might. In case it isn't clear, my argument and this video is subjective. I also chose Alien because I love it. Alien works to my specific tastes on so many levels, but I'm going to mention a few elements that stand out. First is the slow pace and building tension that marks the first half of the film. Like a long take of a jack-in-the-box slowly being wound up, it never lets you go until the chestburster scene. Next is the set and creature design, which combined keep the film feeling fresh and exciting, even to new audiences accustomed to slick VFX and CGI. Third is the soundtrack. Occasionally dated by today's standards, but sparse and restrained, it's frequently unsettling and perfect for the film. Fourth are the tensions and individual character motivations that underpin otherwise mundane interactions. Fifth are the sudden bursts of horror in the second half that, unlike the typical jump scares of today, don't serve to release tension, but rather to ratchet it up a notch as the film builds towards its climax. And finally, sixth are the political ideas or messages that hold up pretty well for a film over 40 years old. There are, of course, plenty more, but these are the ones I'll return to in. I think I've made it pretty clear already that I don't think anything in Alien is the result of a single person, and that the whole film is without doubt the result of the whole team. That said, there certainly are individual aspects that are primarily down to one person. Just as I think it's wrong to ascribe the whole film to one individual, I think it would be wrong to deny the influence certain individuals had over specific parts of the film. So I want to unpack those individual efforts in the elements of the film I mentioned earlier. First, the slow pace of the film, particularly its first half, is mostly down to Dan O'Bannon, who had written the script alone until he got stuck on the now famous chestburster scene, at which point Ron Shusett came in to help. The final film does see some minor revisions from Scott, but if there's a single author to the slow pace that marks the first half of the film, it's O'Bannon. Second is the set and creature design, which is obviously and wholly down to Giger, who designed and often built sets like the Egg Silo and the Space Jockey, and Ron Cobb, who designed the Nostromo and Narcissus sets. Though Scott of course had a hand in realising the scale of the Space Jockey set in particular. Though Cobb's work is brilliant, without Giger in particular, Alien and The Alien would have looked very different. Next is the soundtrack, which, though composed by Jerry Goldsmith, was likely down to Ridley Scott, who rejected Goldsmith's early efforts, requesting something sparse and pared back to the point of absolute minimalism, as well as opting to reuse some of his earlier scores and temp music in the final film. Without Goldsmith, the music would no doubt be different, but it was Scott who ultimately decided what form it would take, much to the chagrin of Goldsmith.
I wrote this very nice main title. There's sort of mystery, but it was a lyrical mystery. It didn't go over too well, and Ridley and I had major disagreements over that. So then I subsequently wrote a new main title, which was the obvious thing, weird and strange, and which everybody loved, and I didn't love, and it was very interesting. Consequently, I kept getting kudos for years after on the main title I wrote for Alien, which was not exactly my choice, and the original one I wrote took me like a day to write it, and the alternate one took me about 5 minutes to write.
Fourth are the tensions that lie beneath the otherwise quite mundane interactions between characters in the first half of the film. I think these are in equal parts the work of O'Bannon's writing, Scott's direction, and of course the actors' performances. Yaphet Kotto and Harry Dean Stanton in particular as representative of the working class in opposition to Sigourney Weaver's Ripley and co. both do a great job at making jokes and jabs that aren't really all that funny.
Before we dock, I think we ought to discuss the bonus situation.
Right.
Brett and I, we think we deserve full shares, right, baby?
You see, Mr. Park and I feel that the bonus situation has never been on an equitable level.
Well, you get what you contracted for like everybody else.
They know the bonus situation won't change in their favour, but they want the rest of the crew to know it too. Between the dialogue, acting, and direction, these underlying tensions are made obvious, but never directly stated, and they feel all the more real for it. Next are the sudden bursts of horror that punctuate the film that I'll attribute to Giger's creature design, Scott's direction, and the performances. Without Giger, I don't think the horror would hold up very well today, while Scott's direction and the crew's performances both lend a depth and reality to what might have otherwise been a very hard-to-believe film. Ron Cobb's set design also plays a big part in particular scenes, and should also be mentioned. This wouldn't be half as scary without shots like these preceding it. Finally, we come to the underlying political angles of the film. While on the surface it would appear the titular alien is the scary part of the film, I think it's actually something else. If the right people had been listened to, no one, other than perhaps Kane, would have died. Corporate interests and insecure leadership, both here personified by Ash, a literal robot, and Dallas, are what ultimately bring the alien on board. Ripley's orders to bar Kane from entry after the facehugger attaches itself to him is undercut by Ash, who at first seems to do so out of scientific curiosity, but is later revealed to be a literal tool of the corporation that employs the crew. Parker meanwhile suggests Kane should be frozen until they can get back to Earth.
How come they don't freeze him? How come you guys don't freeze him?
And is outright ignored by Dallas, further feeding the idea of a class divide within the crew. The real horror of Alien is not the mindless killing machine that you've seen in almost every version of this story, but rather the line, crew expendable. This is all in the writing of the film, which comes down to O'Bannon and Shusett. What isn't in the writing are elements I and other viewers might read into the film. The script was rather famously written with only last names and no assigned genders or physical characteristics. Ripley was just Ripley, not Ellen Ripley, which gave a lot of freedom in casting decisions later in production. Parker is the only black member of the crew, and is one of the blue-collar workers that are left out of the more generous pay their white-collar colleagues receive. Ripley, meanwhile, is a woman who theoretically has a high rank among the crew, but she sees her judgment calls undercut by male colleagues that in theory she outranks.
Ripley, this is an order. Open that hatch right now, do you hear me?
Yes.
Ripley, this is an order! You hear me?
Yes. I read you. The answer is negative.
In the hatch open.
Finally, there's Ash, who, as the representative of the corporation's interests, is a literal robot. It's easy to see these elements of the film and assume deliberate decisions in writing or casting to make or allude to political points, but I don't think it's quite right to do so. I think these elements are both in the writing and in our own reading, and the line where one ends and the next begins is too blurry to be accurately pointed out. Ripley, at the very least, was never specifically imagined as a woman. Does that necessarily mean some of the feminist readings of the film aren't valid? No, but those messages are more likely a part of how someone reads Alien, on top of what's in the film itself. This is a bit of a death of the author type of statement, an idea I'm not going to explore here, but I think it's suffice to say that any given text's meaning is not a result of just the decisions of its creators, or the work as it stands outside of those decisions. The text, how it was made, who made it, the context it was made in, the context it was watched in, and who's watching it, all play a part. So Alien may not have been a deliberately feminist-skewed narrative at its inception, and may not be read as such by many others, but it can be read as such, and to me it doesn't matter why. In a similar manner, Parker is positioned below his white colleagues, and often ignored in what are implied to be group discussions by Dallas. He also wasn't specifically imagined as black in the original script. While in casting or direction, deliberate choices may have been made to allude to issues of racism and classism as they pertain to the real world, but it's also highly probable those interpretations come from the perspective we watch the film from. Watching Alien today, it's striking how poorly he's treated, and how little respect he's given before things start to head south, aspects which were written as commentary on class, but both of which gain a new and deeper context when the challenges he faces can be seen as a result of both classism and racism. Ash is perhaps the most interesting example here in the notion of the auteur. Not only was Ash never imagined as an android in the first drafts of the script, but the people that thought he should be one were left uncredited. It was producers David Gieler and Walter Hill that added the idea to the script.
For some reason I couldn't figure out, Walter Hill immediately started doing rewrites of my script. I remember walking into Gordon Carroll's office and seeing a script on the desk and lifting up the page, and it said Alien by Walter Hill. Gordon walks in. I said, Gordon, what's this? Gordon looked very embarrassed. He said, oh, you're not supposed to see that.
But they contributed one thing, which is one of the best things in the movie, and I will eternally be thankful to them, not only for starting the ball for financing, but to contributing this to the movie. What they invented was the robot. That was not in the movie, where the robot's, Ash is a robot and his head comes off. That whole idea and scenario was theirs.
However minor the revision to make Ash a robot might have been, the impact of doing so, at least on my reading of the film, is huge. The idea an ordinary human, no matter how greedy, would risk the lives of the whole crew, themselves included, for the desires of the company they work for, just doesn't track. But when Ash is the literally programmed idea of the perfect worker, that makes sense. When he becomes the embodiment of capitalist logic, a machine that by design has to put profit over people, Ash pulls the whole film together. It becomes a horror movie with a point, and a science fiction movie with a bite. More than anything else, it pulls the deeper themes surrounding racism, sexism, and classism into focus. It's not just a company that disadvantages individual people, but rather all people, on top of the specific disadvantages Parker and Ripley face. Whether or not all of this is deliberately in the film, or just crops up in my reading of it, is up for debate. But when one of my favourite characters, and one that acts as a linchpin for my whole interpretation of the film, is made because of uncredited revisions to a script, my stance on auteur theory should be pretty clear. So perhaps you're not convinced. Perhaps your idea of a film and its filmmakers really does go by the notion that the director really is the one with the vision that birthed the film. That every other contribution is just that, a contribution to someone else's vision. Okay, I'll certainly grant you that some films are mostly the product of a single person and their interests. You can tell it's a Wes Anderson film from the opening shots alone. Outside of director-led projects, you have screenplays from the likes of Charlie Kaufman, where, whether or not he's directing, there's a particular style, tone, or set of themes that would have me label their screenplay most important. And how about Kevin Feige, whose control over the Marvel Cinematic Universe as a producer has, in my opinion, a greater impact on the films in that universe than any of the individual directors or writers therein. Taika Waititi could be listed among Quentin Tarantino or Wes Anderson as a director that comes close to filling the role of auteur, but even his take on Thor Ragnarok is still distinctly within the bounds of what Feige laid the foundations for. So, sure, there are some people that might come closer to fitting the role than Scott, but I still think even those few aren't and shouldn't be credited as the sole author of their films. The limitations, coincidences, and details that make up a film and how important, or indeed unimportant, they might be to other people is something even the most controlling of directors can't completely control. Given free rein to do whatever they please, I don't think these people would necessarily make better films. Returning to Alien, we could look at some of the different ideas and concepts the creators might have pursued without the interference of other people, and I think it's obvious that the film was far better for the influence of others. If the producers hadn't discouraged him, Scott originally wanted a friendly alien among the crew. If O'Bannon had his way, then the derelict wouldn't have looked like this, but rather like this. And I can't say I could find out what Giger wanted in his ideal version of the film, but I doubt we'd have seen the clash between his curiously organic set design or his somewhat mechanical creature design and the rigid utilitarian interiors of Ron Cobb's Nostromo, the combination of which leads to one of the most striking sequences in the film. It was in the compromise of each principal player's vision that Alien was born, and it was so much better for that compromise. Ultimately, I don't think we can dismiss auteur theory entirely. I don't like it, but in some cases, under certain directors, writers or producers, there are projects that for the most part are at least nearly the result of a singular vision. In the majority of cases, it doesn't hold up though, and while the idea of an auteur can't quite be discarded, I do think it needs to lose the pretentious notion that good or worthwhile films can only come from those select individuals. At least in the case of Alien, I think it's impossible to argue that the film wasn't better for the collaboration that made it. So I'd love to know what you think. Is there a singular vision a film can be attributed to? And if so, whose? On the other side of things, can we entirely dismiss the idea of the auteur? I look forward to reading your thoughts in the comments below, unless you want to talk about the sequels. I really don't want to talk about the sequels. As always, cheers. Have a good one.